I'm Gil Rosen, one of the co-organizers of the BAS conference, also president of Stanford Blockchain Accelerator, which I run with Kuhn and Steven, part of the Blockchain Club, with Jay, Sophie, and Bridget. And we've been putting on this event for you guys, so thank you for being here with us. Next, we've got Dan Robinson from Paradigm, who's going to come and chat for a bit. So.
Hey everyone, I'm Dan Robinson. I'm the head of research at Paradigm, which is a crypto asset investment firm. And I want to say that nothing I talk about here is going to be investment advice. And actually, we are invested in some of the companies that we're talking about here. I used to be a lawyer, so none of this is legal advice, really. But it is going to be mechanism design advice. And specifically, I think we structured part of this talk as an exercise in practical mechanism design and thinking, all right, when we have a practical application level problem, how can we try to solve this with mechanism design? And we'll go through the steps and how you can actually get there and create something that solves a particular need for someone. And the need in this case was a portfolio company of ours that we worked with called Blur. And Blur built an NFT exchange, a professional effort for pro traders of NFTs. And they came in because they wanted to build a protocol for NFT collateralized lending, the ability to borrow against your NFT. Now, why would you want that? So I want to motivate it a little by talking about two pieces of premium high-value property. So one of them is CryptoPunk 7804. This is one of the 9 alien CryptoPunks, one of the rarest of one of the original NFT collections on Ethereum. And this is an empty lot in Palo Alto. There's an empty piece of Palo Alto real estate. Now, both of these pieces of property sold last in spring of 2021. Now, show of hands for who thinks which of these sold for a higher value. So raise your hand if you think CryptoPunk 7804 sold for a higher value. And raise your hand if you think empty lot in Old Palo Alto sold for a higher value. All right, it was the room actually had it. It was the CryptoPunk by just a little. So it sold for $7.5 million. The lot sold for only $6.9 million, although it is back on the market. I checked Zillow. It's back on the market today at only $7.2 million. So if you're looking for an empty lot in Palo Alto, this might be your lucky day. But you know, this is a lot. Like let's face it. You know, these are very reasonable 2021 prices, I suppose, for things. But this is a lot of money. And if you wanted to afford one of these premium pieces of property, but you didn't have all this at hand, one thing you could imagine doing would be borrowing, right? Borrowing against the value of the asset in order to purchase it. Now, if you were able to take out a loan against this property, the real estate, you'd be able to put down just, you know, if you had to put down 20%, just $1.4 million. Now, I learned a lot in creating this gag. Actually, you may not be able to get a 20% down payment mortgage on an empty piece of land, but if you were, just let it ride. If you were, you only have to pay $1.4 million. But I don't know what the actual person who purchased it paid. But I do know that with CryptoPunk 7804, it was all down payment. They had to pay the entire $7.5 million upfront and ETH because there was no way to buy this unleveraged. There's no way to purchase an NFT with credit because there was no way to borrow against one of them. So Blur wanted to support people being able to buy NFTs, their dream NFTs, with less money down, the way that you might buy a house or an empty lot in Palo Alto with a mortgage. All right, so there had been some prior work done, and these are just a couple examples of the protocols that exist in NFT collateralized lending. So some of them are perp-like, and they work like something like Binance perps work. And I won't go too much into details there, but we actually designed a version of NFT to be able to collateralize borrow against NFTs called floor perpetuals. Then there's pooled models. Those work kind of like Compound. Or these other Aave, or these other on-chain lending protocols. And then there was like a different design for peer-to-peer lending, which I'll talk a little more in a bit, And that was the projects like NFTFi and Backed and some other protocols were doing. Now, the advantages of doing the perp-like or the pooled models is that you have perpetual lending. And in crypto, as I think a lot of us know, almost all borrowing and lending, for whatever reason, is perpetual because people don't like having their loans expire. It's inconvenient. The NFTFi, the peer-to-peer model at that time is an expiring loan, and so that's a disadvantage for it. But one advantage that model does have is it doesn't need any price oracles, whereas these other designs need some kind of price oracles for NFTs. Now, why do we think that's a problem? Now, oracles aren't bad for everything. I'll talk a little later about what I think oracles are really good for. But in general, if you're using an oracle, often some oracle designs introduce a new trusted party into the system or some additional dependency. In addition, a lot of NFT designs can be manipulated. If you're able to trade the underlying asset, you might actually be able to easily, for not necessarily that much money, change the price of this in order to affect this protocol on chain. And with NFT liquidity being as low as it is, even at the top of the market, NFT liquidity was much less. NFTs were much less liquid than something like ETH. It's potentially a lot easier to manipulate that price, and so I think that's potentially problematic for a perp-like model or even a pooled-like model. And then there's a deeper reason that I want to talk about and why we don't want to use an oracle for this, which is I don't think the oracles that you have would actually answer the question that you want them to answer. If you were to use something that tells you the price of an NFT, it's not exactly what we want in our lending protocol. And why do I say that? So let's think about what the question we want to answer is when we are trying to liquidate a loan against an NFT. You might think, oh, it's the floor price, right? People talk a lot about I want an oracle for the floor price of an NFT. But technically, the floor price of an NFT is the lowest price that an NFT of that category is listed for. That's the lowest price to buy an NFT. But you actually don't care about that. What you care about is the highest price maybe, and you could sell that NFT, because if you're liquidating a loan, you're going to have to sell that NFT, and you actually, if there's a spread, which often there is between the bid and the ask in the NFT market, you're going to actually have to sell it. You're going to have to cross that spread. So, you know, this is not, I don't think this is what we actually want when we want to liquidate it. Now, that you could maybe do a quick fix. So you'd say, okay, what's the current floor bid? And some exchange designs, including Blur, allow you to bid on the floor of an NFT and put down some money in order to purchase any item on the floor of that series. But do we really want a floor? The floor bid. Think back on that alien punk, right? That alien punk was worth way more than the floor, and so it would be sort of unfair if we could only let them borrow against the floor price. So, like, what if we want you to be able to borrow against an NFT against that actual individual NFT's value? So, okay, you say, all right, we want maybe the current bid for that NFT, and if that's not practical, like, imagine you just get exactly what you would find out exactly what people would pay if you had to sell that NFT immediately. What would be the price that someone would pay? Is that what we want? I don't even think that's exactly what we want. And the reason is that doesn't tell you when to liquidate it. You don't want to liquidate the NFT when it's exactly at the price. Think about if you were liquidating an ETH position at the exact moment that the position becomes insolvent, that the debt is worth more than the collateral. You actually want to leave some margin. You want to leave some, liquidate a little earlier than that. But how much earlier? Like, do you want to have like 20% before 120% collateralization? Do you want it to be like at 150%? That really depends on a lot of properties, including the volatility of that NFT or the expected volatility of it. And that's just something that's very hard to actually calculate in an oracle, right? Like, we actually there's not really an easy way to just like ask some price oracle what that would be. So what is the question? I'm going to get back to my theory later about what I think that actual question here is, once we've talked a little about how this design works and why I think this design actually helps us answer that question better than anything else. So, all right, now is the time we're going to do this exercise in applied mechanism design. We're going to want to design a mechanism for NFT collateralized borrowing that can support arbitrary collateral. Now think about it. Like, an NFT is a pretty abstract object. And if you can support any NFT, you could, in theory, just support anything. You could be able to borrow against anything. You can borrow against fungible tokens. You can borrow against NFTs that are in a series. You could borrow against one-of-ones if you're able to support arbitrary collateral. And so I think it's a very powerful primitive if you're able to do that. And most, things like perps and pooled lending protocols generally can't do that. So it would be very powerful if we're able to support arbitrary collateral. We want to have no expiries. Expiries are just inconvenient. We want to have, if you're borrowing, you should be able to just keep borrowing and rolling your loan. If you're lending, you should generally be able to keep lending. We want to have no oracles. So really precisely what I mean here is there's going to be an oracle in some sense, logically, in this protocol. There kind of has to be somewhere we answer that question, and we don't know what the question is yet. But we're not going to be just relying on some system that's going to tell us what the price of this is. We're going to play a cryptoeconomic game in order to really get at the thing we're actually going for. We want to have the interest rate be determined by the market. We don't want to just like define it by governance. We don't want some sort of like really inefficient way of sort of like guessing at it. We want to have the interest rate determines, okay, like for every borrower, like I'm pretty sure that this is the best price I could be getting, and for the lenders, I think this is the best price that I could be getting. And we want that to change as it changes over time. And finally, we do want to have liquidation because we don't want lenders to be stuck with something that they can't actually sell. Or stuck with collateral that isn't worth as much in most cases. So we want them to be, people to be liquidated when the loan is at risk of insolvency, but we only want them to be liquidated in that case. We don't want someone to have to sell their precious NFT if there actually wasn't any risk of insolvency, and that's pretty important, right? We don't want to like auction off their NFT in the middle of this because, in order to like settle a dispute. It has to be only sold, or they only give up their NFT if it was actually a risk. All right, so how would we start when trying to solve this problem? Well, I'll tell you how we in the Blur team approach this, which I think you look back on this set of prior work, you say, all right, we could either start with the perp-like and pooled models and try to remove the oracles, or we could start with the peer-to-peer model and try to make it not expire. And I wonder what would happen if you actually did the version on the left, but we went with, all right, let's start with a peer-to-peer thing and see, all right, can we get rid of those pesky expiries and see what happens. So let me just tell you about how that mechanism works. It's implemented by NFT Backed and some other protocols for peer-to-peer expiring loans with arbitrary collateral. So the way it works is Alice and Bob, Alice wants to borrow against her CryptoPunk, and Bob wants to lend ETH against the CryptoPunk. So the protocol, it matches them just one-to-one. It says, okay, you've got some offer, Alice has got some offer to borrow. Bob comes in and is willing to lend. So Bob gives one ETH diamond to Alice on day one, and then Alice at that time locks up her CryptoPunk as collateral. On day 30, at the end of the expiration of this loan, Alice has to come back in, show up, and pay. We got like 2 ETH, whatever, right? I has to pay ETH. The original loan plus interest, or if she doesn't show up, if she does nothing, then Bob gets the CryptoPunk. Otherwise, Alice gets her CryptoPunk back. So this basically works. But if you think about the mechanics of this carefully, one problem with this is this actually is we call it a loan, but in some ways it's actually an option because Alice actually here has the option just not to show up. And why might she do that? She might do that if the NFT has gone down in value below what she would actually have to repay for the loan. And in that case, Bob is going to end up on day 30 with the less valuable of these two things, right? If the punk has gone below that value, then Bob ends up with the punk. If it's above, Bob gets the ETH back, right? So there's some option value to this loan. And so that's one reason why you can't have a very long-lived loan like this, because then the option value becomes way too high. The other problem with this is it's kind of inconvenient, right? Alice has to actually show up and remember to show up and repay this, and then she has to go find a new loan if she wants to borrow against this again. And it's a transaction on chain. It's a whole thing. And there have been cases where people using NFT and protocols like that have forgotten to show up and repay their loan. So and then they lose their NFT, which is unfortunate. So we want to avoid that. How would we do that? Well, one way, let's just say, all right, often Alice and Bob are just going to want to keep continuing this on the same terms. So let's say by default, if Alice and Bob don't do anything, we'll just roll it over and we'll have them do the next 30 days at the same interest rate. So here now, it's the same, just extortionary, usurious 100% interest rate. All right, now it's going to be compared to 4 ETH that have to be paid after 60 days, or they get liquidated at that point. And so at any time, Alice can come in and say like, all right, I actually want to repay and close this out. At any time, Bob could come and say, I need to be repaid in this period. But if nobody does anything, then this loan would keep going. So that's a little nicer. And you can also see already how this could let us shorten those days, right? Because you might want to do 30 days because it's inconvenient to roll this. But if it happens automatically every day, this could be like day 1, day 2, day 3, and just automatically roll it over every day. So that it's already starting to look a little nicer from that perspective, and that gives you a little less of the option value because of shorter periods. Okay, but what happens when this still has an expiry in the case where Bob wants to leave the loan, right? So if Bob actually wants to exit, Alice is now stuck because She's got, as soon as Bob demands repayment, Alice is like, go get that money and repay and do something else. It'd be very nice if when Bob wanted to leave, we could let someone else take over if someone else is willing to. So that's how you get to, all right, what if at the end of this period we do an auction? We just do a Dutch auction, my favorite kind of auction. You do a Dutch auction, my second favorite kind of auction. I have a list of auctions. My favorite kind of auction is a batch auction. My second favorite kind is a Dutch auction. But this one is a Dutch auction. So we're going to do a Dutch auction, interestingly, in interest rate space. And so we're going to start, at the moment that Bob demands repayment, Bob is going to, does a transaction on chain that starts an auction to get someone else to come in and take over that loan. And the interest rate at which someone would have to come in and get that loan at, a new lender would get that loan at, increases over time as people don't show up. So it starts with like 0%, probably no one's going to come in quite yet, but then it goes to like 1%, 2%, 3%. Eventually, it's higher than Bob had been lending at. But eventually, maybe if this NFT is still sufficiently collateralized, if this loan is still sufficiently collateralized, someone comes in and they are going to take over the loan at some interest rate. So that's how we get our market-determined interest rate. Someone's going to come in, and if it's still sound and it makes sense to lend against that, and they're going to take over the loan. So that's nice. Now, this is only going to happen if the NFT is actually at a sufficient price where anyone's going to want to lend against it, right? If the NFT is only worth 100 ETH and the loan is for 110 ETH, there's almost no chance anyone's going to want to come in. So what happens there? Well, eventually this Dutch auction is going to creep up and it's going to go to some crazy number. I think like 1,000%. I don't remember how it's implemented, but think like 1,000%. At that point, it's like, okay, so if no one's willing to lend at 1,000% interest rate, we're going to say that's what we call this a liquidation. That means no one's willing to take this over. Clearly, the NFT is not worth the debt. So in that case, the current lender, the auction has failed. The current lender takes possession of the NFT. The borrower is liquidated. But notice this only happened because there was basically no one in the world willing to take on that loan at basically any interest rate. And so that's basically the mechanism. And so notice like this, what this has given us. So it has arbitrary collateral. At no point were we making any assumptions about the collateral. It's just all that has to happen is some lender has to look at that collateral and think I'm willing to lend against that, right? For the loan to actually get started. We didn't, there's no governance or anything necessary around what is allowed to be used as collateral because it's entirely decided by the lender. There's no expiries. At least for the borrower, there is no expiry. The borrower's position, if they've got to borrow, it's just going to stay open until someday they get liquidated because their position was insufficiently, it was too risky for anyone to be willing to take it on. There's no oracles. Nowhere was somebody saying like, oh, here we think this is the price of this NFT. All that happens is just like nobody showed up to get this NFT, right? So it's a crypto-economic oracle because what we answered was this question of is anybody willing to do this, to take this loan on. The interest rate is determined by the market. If interest rates go down, one mechanism I didn't describe here is someone else could come in and undercut the existing interest rates. You could allow other lenders to compete to lower the interest rate when interest rates go down. If interest rates go up, the lender can trigger a liquidation, and then the new interest rate is discovered in the market through the Dutch auction. And finally, the liquidation only happens when the loan is actually at risk of insolvency, when nobody is willing to actually take on that loan at that risk. So getting back to that question, what is the question that we are trying to solve with this protocol? What does this protocol need to know? I contend that when you're deciding whether to liquidate a loan backed by an NFT, the most important question is, would anybody in the world be willing to take over this loan for a day at any interest rate? And that question, it encapsulates basically everything we were looking for, including what margin of liquidation you should have, right? Because it says like if nobody's willing, suppose it's really it's a very volatile NFT, but it's still technically above the price. It's still technically above the price of that NFT that someone might be willing to pay, but it's very iffy. Someone may not be willing to take on that loan in that case because they're accounting for the volatility, and they'd be worried about taking over that loan even at 1,000% interest rate. And so I think this is about the most objective you can do. I think that for a day, is sort of like hand waving here. Why is it 1 day? Why couldn't it be? It might be better to have it be a somewhat shorter period. I think a day is how long we wanted to run the auction for this, just to make sure you really can get make it a competitive auction. But that's a constant. You can change that in the protocol. The point here is the question you're answering, in my view, this is more accurate than any oracle could be, any off-chain oracle. Even if you've completely trusted the source, you wouldn't. They just don't know whether anyone in the world would be willing to take this on. And you shouldn't be liquidating somebody if someone is willing to say, if anyone in the world is willing to extend a lifeline and say, okay, I will refinance that for you. I think it'd be wrong to actually liquidate a borrower if someone else is willing to step in, because it's always better to be extended, to have your loan extended, even at a crazy usurious interest rate, than to actually have it repossessed, to have it be liquidated. I would contend. So that's I think the question. Now I'm not like an oracle, an anti-oracle zealot. I think there are a lot of cases where it makes sense to use oracles and non-cryptoeconomic oracles. Anything where you have inherently off-chain information, something that's there's non-economic information, like who won the Super Bowl, that you have something that depends on a prediction market on chain. But even just the question of what the price of $1 is in ETH, it's not inherently off-chain information. You might have USDC or something on chain, but I think it's plausible that you might have a protocol that wants to know what's the price of a dollar measured in ETH. And having an oracle for that fact might just be inherently off-chain information. You might want to trust an oracle more than you might want to trust a custodial system that holds USDC. So I think there's reasons to have that. It might be very urgent information. So I think particularly about some designs for DEX that use a very recent price, off-chain price, say for example the ETH USDT price on Binance, in order to affect how behavior on the DEX works. I think that's important because you don't get to hold a whole one-day auction for that. We need to know right now this thing that happened off-chain less than 12 seconds ago, and really the only way is through some kind of someone coming in and telling you. And then finally, certain kinds of computed information. If you did want to know what's the volatility, the realized volatility for some reason for your option pricing model or something, you might want to use that. But again, notice that when we were answering this question encapsulates a lot of that information. It encapsulates expected or implied volatility. It encapsulates a lot of that. And so you might want to just think, do one click deeper when you're designing a protocol and think actually, do I want to design it in this way where I'm going to define a calculation on chain and then use an oracle to give me the inputs of that calculation, or do I want to just run a contest, run an auction or something on chain to answer the question, the ultimate question that I actually really care about. Anyway, so Blur uses design and built it into the Blend protocol, and you can see here the big green splash is when Blend launched. So now the leading NFT lending protocol on NFT collateralized lending protocol on Ethereum. And I think a big part of it is the user experience benefits that you get from not having expiries, and I think to some extent just the reliability and the flexibility that you get from having no oracle. Great. So thanks everyone. I think I have a little time for some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, you showed the chart and saw that green a spike from Blend. Is that all from the technical advantages of Blend, or are they incentives and play?
Yeah, so there are incentives on Blend, which is a great question. The incentives generally are on lending, not on borrowing. In fact, specifically, it's on offering loans, not on borrowing. So in general, it doesn't incentivize borrow volume below 0% interest rate. But yes, this is definitely influence. You should always with on-chain data, you should always take into account what are there incentive programs at play. So this certainly the growth of it was bootstrapped a lot with the incentive program, is my understanding. Yes. Is there another mic or anything? What's that? I can repeat the questions. That's great. It's good protocol.
Yeah, so very quick, just two questions. The first is, right now, semi-fungible. Were they just semi-fungible in the beginning?
Yeah. So the first question was, right now, mostly liquidation auctions succeed, and if the incentives to have lending liquidity on the books stopped, would that stop? I think it would probably change the equilibrium. And if you get rid of the incentives, you might end up with, I would presume, probably higher interest rates and lower LTVs. So but then I might expect that would also change the behavior of borrowers and cause them to be more careful. So again, it's hard to say ultimately where the equilibrium would go. Well, I think yeah, it seems plausible that it would be more, you'd more often have failed liquidations, but then I think borrowers would, I would imagine, be more careful as a result. And I'm sort of like I'm less close to the specifics of particularly the incentives, but a lot of how it's playing out on chain. And I'm sorry, the other question? Yeah, do collection offers fungify NFTs? I think possibly. I think it contributes to this dynamic. I do think in the design of Blend, certainly, like part of the goal is to design something that doesn't depend on fungibility of NFTs. So with Blend, with the lending protocol, right? There's nothing in this protocol. Or at least certainly in part, the parts of the protocol that I've described here. There's a little you could say in like the way that the lending offers work. But in these parts of the protocol, there's nothing about it that depends on it being a semi-fungible NFT collection. And I think that's important, in part because I think like one of the coolest things about NFTs, it can represent a much wider set of kinds of assets or collateral than fungible tokens. Kind of could represent that Palo Alto real estate, right? Like imagine you could put that, if you had that on chain, then you could just like run a worldwide auction. Like right now, I think it would be hard to get an 80% loan probably against that thing. But like if you ran a worldwide auction, maybe you could, which I think is interesting. And so I think that depends on this thing not acting kind of like a fungible token. And I think that's important because, you know, like some of these other designs here, like in pooled models don't really do that. They do it by trying to fit NFTs more into a fungible bucket. And I think it's important. Yes? When what happens, isn't it too late? Well, yes. Well, I think what it means is this should be liquidated, right? Maybe it's like it should have immediately been liquidated, but that's my point. Yes. Well, no, not necessarily. It could be if it's worth like slightly more. Still, nobody might be willing to take it over. Because if you take it over, then what would be the first thing you do? Maybe you trigger a liquidation auction, and that takes a day. It actually takes 30 hours, I think, right now in the protocol. So that's why I have the for a day there. Maybe it should be for 30 hours, which is to say, like you may not want to take it over, even if it's still fully collateralized. So again, I think one of the points that I maybe glossed over here is this system does depend on the existence of sophisticated lenders. Really, you're relying on the lender to make these kinds of assessments themselves. So a sophisticated market where you have lenders who are able to make these kind of assessments and willing to bear that risk is an important assumption of this system. But one that I think is actually increasingly reasonable in the modern crypto ecosystem. Yes? Does the Dutch auction model become inefficient in the case of black swan events? Why?
Because of the increased volatility in the market. Because you bid higher, but the change of the external factors goes with a higher pace.
Yes. So you're saying, and the alternative you're saying would be like have an oracle that liquidates you faster? Yeah. I think that's possible. I think people have objected in the past to the fast liquidation for exactly that reason, though. Because if, like, suppose there's a huge shift in the market, like suddenly, right? If you instantly liquidate everybody, you actually like cascade the whole thing to zero. And I think the slower, like, you know, there's a trade-off. There's just a necessary trade-off here between how aggressively you're going to liquidate. And I think, you know, there's an argument that actually having a slower liquidation means the market cascades is less likely, right? It's like, okay, it's like you get a little time to actually test, is this really?
Wouldn't be a system that takes into attribution the previous or current volatility of the markets be more efficient in this case, rather than just the Dutch auction?
That takes into account the
historical values in X ticks, for example.
Well, I think the idea is the lenders should be taking that into account when they trigger liquidation. They should, if it's a very volatile market, lenders should be triggering liquidation sooner. So that's the idea. It's like they have to take that into account. And the idea is the protocol is unopinionated on exactly when they should do that, and it's up to the lender about exactly when they do it. Yes, final question, Will. Do I think there's any improvement for borrower UX during auctions? You tell me. Have you used it? I haven't used it. I don't know. Yeah, I think there are notifications, right? Like I think the Blur sends emails maybe, but yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I think again, like it's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think in general it would be good if borrowers know. Again, letting people have 30 hours to is I think an important part of that, and that's like why they set that thing. Having some off-chain notifications is useful for it. What else could you do? I don't know. All right, thanks everyone for having me.